We've all heard that appearances can be deceiving. But for one Denver billionaire, a single act of cruelty would cost him everything. When Grant Holloway kicked a scarred German shepherd and shoved its homeless owner into the snow, he thought he was humiliating a broken veteran. He had no idea he had just provoked a legendary rescuer and uncovered the first thread of a conspiracy that would destroy his empire. Hours before Grant Holloway's cruelty would expose the first crack in his empire, Denver disappeared beneath a wall of snow. The storm rolled down from the Rocky Mountains shortly after midnight, burying sidewalks, silencing traffic, and turning the glass towers downtown into pale shadows. Across from Liberty House, an aging residence for veterans and their families, a rusted, dark blue Ford pickup sat beneath a broken street lamp. Inside the truck lived Mason Reed. At 41, Mason was tall and powerfully built, though years of exhaustion had hollowed his cheeks and sharpened the angles of his rugged face. His dark brown hair had grown unevenly over his ears, and a short, neglected beard concealed a thin scar along his jaw. He wore a faded Air Force jacket over a gray thermal shirt, heavy work pants, and boots repaired with black tape. Mason rarely smiled. He spoke politely but briefly, avoiding questions about his past. Once, he had been a pararescue specialist, trained to enter burning wreckage, collapsing buildings, and hostile territory to bring strangers home alive. Then a concrete bunker had collapsed around his team during a rescue mission. Mason survived beneath the debris for 11 hours. 3 men beside him did not. Since then, closed rooms made his lungs tighten. Walls seemed to move inward. Ceilings became tons of broken concrete waiting to fall. Although his military pension remained untouched in a bank account, Mason slept in his truck because its windows gave him 4 directions of escape. A scarred German shepherd lay across the passenger seat. Atlas was an 11-year-old retired military working dog with a broad chest, a dark facial mask, and intelligent amber eyes. Part of his left ear was missing, and a pale scar crossed his right shoulder beneath thinning fur. Arthritis had stiffened his rear leg, giving him a slight limp, but his attention remained sharp. Every passing engine, opening door, and distant footstep earned a careful glance. Atlas had served beside Mason during overseas rescue operations. Now he watched over him in Denver. Shortly after sunrise, a woman emerged from Liberty House carrying a folder beneath her coat. Olivia Bennett was 38, slim, medium height, with chestnut brown hair tied into a practical low ponytail. Her green eyes looked tired but determined. A legal aid attorney, she had spent months representing the 24 veteran families facing eviction from the building. Behind her walked Caleb, her 10-year-old son. Caleb was small for his age, with straight brown hair, solemn hazel eyes, and a red-knitted hat pulled low over his forehead. Since his father's death, he had spoken only when necessary. Yet whenever he saw Atlas, some of the tension left his face. The boy approached the truck and slipped 2 pieces of cooked chicken through the partially opened window. "For him," Caleb whispered. Atlas accepted them gently. Olivia stopped beside Mason's door. "There's an empty room inside. No paperwork. No questions." Mason stared at Liberty House. Even from the truck, the narrow windows and low ceilings made his heartbeat accelerate. "I'm fine here." "You're freezing." "I've survived worse." Olivia knew pushing harder would only make him retreat. She placed a folded eviction notice beneath his windshield wiper instead. At the bottom was the name of the developer seeking to demolish Liberty House, Holloway Urban Development. Mason read it without comment. Then he looked at the 24 lit windows across the street and quietly turned up the truck's failing heater. By late morning, the storm had weakened, but Denver's streets remained buried beneath gray slush and wind-packed snow. Mason had driven 3 blocks from Liberty House to the Grand Meridian Hotel because Olivia needed to deliver additional documents to a city housing representative meeting there. Caleb rode with her, while Mason and Atlas followed in the old pickup so the boy would not have to walk through the freezing wind. The Grand Meridian rose above downtown like a polished monument to wealth, its glass entrance framed by heated sidewalks, brass columns and uniformed attendants. A black luxury SUV stopped beneath the hotel canopy just as Mason parked across the street. Grant Holloway stepped out. At 36, Grant was tall, lean, and meticulously groomed, with swept-back blonde hair, pale blue eyes, and the controlled smile of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. His navy cashmere coat was tailored perfectly across his shoulders, and a silver watch gleamed beneath one cuff. Raised inside a powerful real estate family, Grant had learned early that money could turn resistance into cooperation. What others called cruelty, he considered efficiency. He had come to negotiate the purchase of Summit Shield Rescue, a private company specializing in evacuating civilians, protecting aid workers, and recovering personnel from hostile regions. Grant cared little about rescue work. He wanted its federal contracts, government clearances, and respected name. Near the revolving doors stood Emma Price, a 24-year-old hotel employee with curly black hair, round glasses, and an observant expression. Emma worked the front desk while studying journalism at night. After watching powerful guests mistreat employees without consequences, she had developed a habit of quietly documenting anything that seemed wrong. Across the street, Caleb noticed Atlas climbing out of Mason's truck. The boy slipped away from Olivia and hurried toward the dog, holding a small paper bag of chicken. He was so focused on Atlas that he stepped from between two parked vehicles and onto the road. A delivery van turned the corner too quickly. Its tires lost traction on the ice. The vehicle began sliding sideways toward Caleb. Atlas reacted before anyone else. Ignoring the stiffness in his hind leg, the German Shepherd lunged from the curb, caught the back of Caleb's coat gently between his teeth, and dragged him toward the sidewalk. The van missed them by inches before crashing into a snowbank. Its spinning tires sprayed a wave of filthy snow across the hotel entrance. Most of it struck Grant Holloway. Grant stared at the brown slush covering his expensive coat. Then he saw Atlas standing protectively over Caleb and mistook the scene for an attack. "You filthy animal!" Before Mason could reach them, Grant drove his polished shoe into Atlas's scarred right shoulder. The dog cried out and collapsed against the curb. "Don't hurt Atlas!" Caleb screamed. It was the loudest sentence he had spoken since his father's death. Mason crossed the distance in seconds. Grant shoved him hard in the chest, sending him backward into the snow. "Control that street dog," Grant snapped. "It's a public danger." Olivia rushed forward and placed herself between them. "That dog just saved my son." Grant recognized her from the Liberty House case. His expression sharpened. "Keep interfering with my projects, counselor, and I'll make certain the State Bar hears how you threaten developers in public." Emma had already raised her phone. From beside the hotel doors, she recorded every word. Grant pulled a checkbook from inside his coat, wrote a number without looking, and tossed the check onto Mason's chest. "Buy a cleaner dog." Mason rose slowly. He could see Grant's exposed throat, unstable footing, and unprotected knee. 3 movements would have ended the confrontation. Then Atlas pressed his head against Mason's hand. The familiar touch broke through the rage. Mason curled his fingers into the dog's wet fur and forced himself to breathe. Grant turned toward the hotel, unaware that Emma's camera was still recording as the glass doors closed behind him. Atlas began struggling to breathe before Grant Holloway disappeared through the hotel doors. His chest rose in short, uneven movements, and his injured right leg trembled whenever he tried to stand. Mason immediately knelt beside him, supporting the dog's weight with both arms while forcing his own voice to remain calm. Olivia abandoned her meeting and directed Mason to a non-profit veterinary clinic 6 blocks away. 20 minutes later, they entered the Rocky Mountain Animal Relief Center, where wounded service animals and pets belonging to low-income families received free treatment. Dr. Hannah Lee met them in the examination room. Hannah was a 43-year-old Korean-American veterinarian with a slender build, shoulder-length black hair, and calm brown eyes that seemed to notice pain before anyone described it. She spoke gently but directly, a manner shaped by years of treating frightened military dogs and the veterans who often trusted animals more easily than people. After losing her younger brother to suicide following his return from Afghanistan, Hannah had dedicated part of her clinic to retired working dogs and trauma survivors. She examined Atlas's ribs, listened to his breathing, and ordered x-rays. Mason stood beside the table with his hands clenched tightly enough to whiten his scarred knuckles. The images showed no broken bones, but the impact had inflamed old nerve and muscle damage around Atlas's scarred shoulder. Hannah explained that the original injury had never fully healed. Another hard blow in the same area could damage the nerves controlling his front leg and leave him unable to walk normally. Mason lowered his head. "He's saved me more times than I can count," he said quietly. "Today he needed me, and I let someone hurt him." Olivia watched the rigid veteran's expression fracture for the first time. Mason was not emotionless. He was carrying years of guilt so heavy that he believed every new injury was another failure he deserved. Hannah placed Atlas on pain medication and ordered complete rest overnight. Caleb refused to leave the dog's side. He sat on the floor beside the padded recovery bed, gently rubbing Atlas's uninjured ear. At first, he whispered only a few words. Then the words came faster. He told Atlas about his father, about the empty chair at breakfast, and about how afraid he had been when the van slid toward him. Olivia listened from the hallway, realizing her son was speaking more in 1 hour than he had during the previous month. While Atlas rested, Olivia opened the Liberty House inspection documents she had carried to the hotel. Several approval forms appeared to contain identical signatures, even though they had supposedly been signed by different city inspectors on different dates. One signature belonged to an official who had retired before the inspection occurred. Later that evening, Walter Briggs arrived at the clinic after hearing what had happened. Walter was a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran with a bent frame, silver mustache, and weathered hands that shook slightly from age. Normally humorous and stubbornly independent, he became serious when Olivia showed him the documents. Walter admitted that Grant's representative had offered him money to convince the other residents to leave Liberty House voluntarily. He had refused, but several elderly tenants were frightened enough to consider accepting. Across town, Emma sat alone in the hotel employee locker room, replaying the video on her phone. Posting it could expose Grant's cruelty. But Holloway Urban Development owned part of the hotel and employed attorneys capable of burying her in lawsuits. She saved 3 copies of the recording, then stared at the upload button without pressing it. Back at the clinic, Mason remained beside Atlas as snow gathered outside the window. He placed one hand against the dog's neck and made a silent promise that the next time danger came, he would not fail him. The following morning, Mason returned to the Grand Meridian, carrying the check Grant Holloway had thrown at him. Atlas remained under Dr. Hannah Lee's supervision, while Caleb stayed nearby with Olivia. Mason had not come for money, revenge, or public recognition. He wanted Grant to take back the insult and apologize to Atlas in front of the boy who had watched the dog save his life. Inside the hotel, Grant was meeting executives from Summit Shield Rescue, hoping to purchase the company and gain access to federal rescue contracts worth billions of dollars. The acquisition would also give Holloway Urban Development the security clearances and government relationships Grant could not buy directly. Near the front desk, Emma Price watched Mason cross the marble lobby. During the night, she had copied her recording to a private cloud account, an external drive, and 2 encrypted email drafts. She still feared losing her job, but she feared even more that Grant's attorneys might erase the only proof of what had happened. Mason had nearly reached the elevators when 2 security contractors stepped into his path. The first was Derek Cole, a broad, 39-year-old former police officer with a shaved head and a habit of using physical intimidation before conversation. Beside him stood Marcus Vane, 35, taller and leaner, with close-cropped black hair and restless eyes that constantly checked Grant's location. Marcus was more cautious than Derek, but years of protecting wealthy clients had taught him to obey quickly and question later. "Mr. Holloway doesn't meet with people like you," Derek said, reaching for Mason's arm. Mason moved before the guard completed the grab. He rotated Derek's wrist, redirected his momentum, and guided him face first against a padded column without striking him. Marcus rushed forward and attempted to lock both arms around Mason's chest. Mason lowered his weight, trapped Marcus's elbow, and turned him smoothly onto the carpet. Within seconds, Derek was immobilized against the column, and Marcus was pinned on one knee, unable to move without injuring himself. Mason's breathing never changed. "I don't want to hurt either of you," he said. "Stop trying to make me." The entire lobby fell silent. Guests froze beside their luggage, and hotel employees stared from behind the reception desk. Mason released both guards once they stopped resisting, straightened his weathered jacket, and continued toward the private conference room. Behind him, Emma quietly began recording again. Inside the meeting room, Grant sat across from Rebecca Shaw, founder and chief executive of Summit Shield Rescue. Rebecca was 52, tall and athletic, with silver-streaked dark hair cut to her jaw and a thin scar crossing one eyebrow. A retired Air Force colonel, she had spent decades directing recovery teams in war zones and disaster areas. She was disciplined, blunt, and famously difficult to pressure. After losing 2 rescue specialists during a mission compromised by a dishonest contractor, Rebecca had developed an instinctive distrust of executives who treated human lives as numbers. Grant had already offered twice the company's estimated value, but she had refused because his background suggested he wanted Summit Shield's contracts rather than its mission. "Everything has a price," Grant insisted as Mason entered. Rebecca looked toward the door. The color left her face. She rose so quickly that her chair rolled backward. Mason placed Grant's check on the table. "You gave me this yesterday," he said. "Take it back. Then apologize to the boy and the dog you hurt." Grant began to call for security, but Rebecca was no longer listening to him. She studied Mason's scarred hands, rigid posture, and faded Air Force jacket, as though recognizing someone from another lifetime. Then she stood at attention. "Guardian 6, she whispered. "We were told you disappeared." Across town, Olivia opened an anonymous email from Peter Nolan, Grant's 48-year-old financial assistant. Peter was a quiet, narrow-shouldered man with thinning brown hair who had spent 18 years managing Grant's private accounts. The message contained one sentence. "The Liberty House inspections were never legitimate, and I can prove who paid for them." For several seconds, the Grand Meridian conference room remained silent. Rebecca Shaw continued staring at Mason as if a man listed among the missing had walked out of a grave. Grant Holloway looked between them, irritated that the veteran he had dismissed as homeless now commanded more attention than his billion-dollar proposal. "Guardian 6 was Mason's rescue call sign," Rebecca finally said. Her voice remained controlled, but the emotion beneath it was unmistakable. 9 years ago, an American surveillance aircraft went down in the Hindu Kush during a winter operation. 2 pilots survived the crash, but they were trapped on a mountain controlled by insurgents. Mason's face hardened. He did not interrupt, yet his eyes seemed to leave the room. Rebecca explained that Mason had led a pararescue team through freezing darkness to reach the wreckage. Before they could evacuate the pilots, their rescue helicopter was struck by enemy fire and crashed against the mountainside. 3 members of Mason's team were killed. Several others were badly wounded, leaving Mason as the only rescuer still capable of fighting and providing medical care. For 19 hours, he defended the crash site, treated the injured, and moved survivors between rocky positions while enemy fighters closed around them. Atlas had been younger then, faster and nearly unstoppable. When the team's main radio was destroyed, Mason secured a compact communication device inside Atlas's protective vest and ordered him to reach a reinforcement unit positioned beyond the ridge. The German Shepherd ran through gunfire, crossed exposed snow, and delivered the device. He then returned before the reinforcements arrived. Atlas found one of the pilots trapped inside the burning helicopter, Rebecca continued. He went into the smoke, seized the man's flight harness, and dragged him clear seconds before the fuel compartment exploded. Shrapnel tore through Atlas's right shoulder, creating the scar Grant had kicked the previous day. Mason received one of the nation's highest military decorations, but he never considered the mission a victory. After the funerals of his 3 teammates, he left active service, rejected public ceremonies, and eventually disappeared from the veteran support system. Survival had become something he carried like a crime. Later that afternoon, Olivia brought Caleb to the hotel after Hannah confirmed that Atlas was resting safely. Caleb looked at Mason with open admiration. "You saved all those people," he said. Mason crouched so they were at eye level. "Atlas carried the radio. Atlas went back into the fire. He brought help when I couldn't. He's the hero." Across town, Peter Nolan met Olivia inside a quiet public library. His nervous hands shook as he transferred dozens of internal emails onto her encrypted drive. The messages showed that Grant had authorized payments to 2 building inspectors in exchange for declaring Liberty House structurally unsafe. A newer email revealed something worse. Holloway Urban Development planned to arrange an emergency maintenance failure that would shut down the building's heating system during the coldest week of winter. Grant expected the residents to leave voluntarily once the rooms became unlivable. At the Grand Meridian, Emma Price finally made her decision. She uploaded the video with the faces of Caleb and the hotel's junior employees blurred for protection. The footage showed Atlas saving the boy, Grant kicking the injured dog, and Mason refusing to retaliate. Within an hour, it had been shared thousands of times. By nightfall, millions had watched it. Reporters gathered outside the hotel, veterans posted photographs of Atlas from his service years, and animal lovers demanded accountability. Grant stood alone in his suite, watching his name become synonymous with cruelty. In the clinic, Mason sat beside Atlas and gently touched the scar that had once been earned in fire. For the first time, the world knew what Grant had struck, and whom he had chosen to humiliate. By sunrise, Grant Holloway had transformed public humiliation into a coordinated counterattack. His attorneys released a statement claiming Mason Reed had invaded a private business meeting and violently assaulted 2 licensed security contractors. A polished public relations consultant appeared on local television, describing Grant as the victim of an unstable former soldier and Atlas as an uncontrolled street animal that had endangered a child outside the Grand Meridian. Grant paid online commentators to question Emma's edited video and used his influence with city officials to demand an immediate investigation. That afternoon, 2 animal control officers arrived at Dr. Hannah Lee's clinic with a temporary seizure order. Their supervisor, Daniel Mercer, was a 46-year-old man with a heavy build, graying hair, and a tired face shaped by 20 years of handling frightened animals and angry owners. He was firm but not cruel, and he apologized before explaining that the complaint accused Atlas of attacking Caleb and threatening Grant. Until the investigation was complete, the dog had to be placed in municipal custody. Mason stood beside Atlas's recovery bed, one hand resting on the German Shepherd's neck. He wanted to resist, but doing so would support Grant's claim that he was dangerous. Atlas was led away wearing a medical support harness, repeatedly turning his scarred head toward Mason until the clinic doors closed between them. The separation shattered what remained of Mason's control. That night, without Atlas's breathing beside him, the walls of the clinic waiting room seemed to narrow. The fluorescent lights became emergency strobes, the heating pipes became distant gunfire, and the rumble of a snowplow became the collapsing bunker from his past. Mason stumbled outside, unable to breathe, convinced that everyone near him would eventually be punished for helping him. Before dawn, he returned to his truck, packed his few belongings, and started driving toward the highway. Meanwhile, Emma released the complete, unedited recording. The longer footage clearly showed Caleb stepping into the road, Atlas pulling him away from the sliding van, and Grant kicking the dog before Mason ever entered the hotel. Hannah submitted a formal veterinary statement confirming that Atlas had displayed no aggressive behavior and had acted only to protect Caleb. At Liberty House, Walter Briggs gathered the residents in the dining hall. 24 veteran families voted unanimously to reject Holloway's relocation payments and remain in the building, even if the heating failed. Across the city, Peter Nolan met with Special Agent Laura Mitchell of the FBI. Laura was 44, compact and sharply dressed, with dark hair cut above her shoulders and a patient manner that encouraged frightened witnesses to keep talking. Peter agreed to provide Grant's emails and financial records, but his voice shook when he mentioned his wife and teenage daughter. He knew Grant kept private investigators on payroll and feared retaliation. Before Mason reached the interstate, Olivia traced his truck through a parking receipt left inside Caleb's coat pocket. She, Caleb, and Rebecca found him at an abandoned service station on the outskirts of Denver. Mason stood beside the truck with his bag packed, refusing to meet their eyes. "Grant hurts everyone who gets close to me," he said. "If I leave, this ends." Rebecca told him leaving would only give Grant the story he wanted. Olivia reminded him that Atlas had been taken because Mason had obeyed the law, not because he had failed. Caleb stepped forward through the snow, his red hat pulled low over his face. "If you go," he said, "Atlas will think his best friend gave up on him." Mason closed his eyes. For several seconds, only the wind moved. Then he removed his bag from the truck and placed it back behind the seat. He was still afraid, but for the first time he chose not to run. The Denver City Council chamber was filled beyond capacity by the time the Liberty House demolition hearing began. Veterans occupied nearly every public seat, some wearing old service jackets, others holding photographs of the building they had called home for years. Reporters crowded the rear wall, while Grant Holloway entered through a side door surrounded by 6 corporate attorneys. He wore a flawless charcoal suit and the confident expression of a man who still believed every institution had a price. At the center of the raised council platform sat Margaret Ellis, the 60-year-old council chair. Margaret was a tall, silver-haired former public school principal known for her measured voice and strict respect for procedure. Years earlier, she had lost a brother to homelessness after his military service, though she rarely allowed that private grief to influence her decisions openly. Grant's lead attorney argued that Liberty House was unsafe, financially unsustainable, and required immediate demolition. He presented engineering reports declaring the structure dangerous and described Holloway Urban Development's relocation payments as generous assistance. Several council members appeared prepared to approve the project. Then Olivia Bennett rose. She placed Peter Nolan's financial records, internal emails, and inspection documents before the council. One payment connected Grant's company to a building inspector only 3 days before Liberty House received a failing report. Another document carried the signature of an official who had retired months earlier. Finally, Olivia displayed Grant's written authorization for an emergency heating interruption intended to force residents out during the winter. Peter entered through the witness door. He looked pale beneath the chamber lights, but his voice steadied as he testified that Grant had ordered the payments and instructed staff to disguise them as consulting fees. Grant glared at him from across the room, silently promising consequences. Peter noticed 2 FBI agents near the exit and continued speaking. Emma then submitted the unedited hotel footage. The chamber watched Atlas pull Caleb away from the sliding van. Grant kicked the wounded dog, shoved Mason into the snow, and threatened Olivia's career. A second recording captured Grant demanding that Atlas be destroyed. Caleb asked permission to speak. The 10-year-old stood at the microphone, wearing his red knitted hat. His hands trembled, but he did not step away. "Atlas didn't attack me," he said. "He saved me. I was too scared to move, and he came back for me even though his leg already hurt. Then Mr. Holloway kicked him." The room became completely silent. Caleb looked toward Mason. "Atlas helps people when they're afraid. Liberty House does that too. Please don't take either of them away." One by one, previously undecided council members requested that their votes be changed. The demolition proposal was rejected, and Liberty House received emergency protected status pending an independent investigation. Mason was invited to address the council. He did not ask for Grant's wealth, punishment, or public humiliation. "Protect the families who live there," he said, and give me back my dog." As the hearing adjourned, Special Agent Laura Mitchell approached Grant with an arrest warrant. He was taken into custody on allegations of federal bribery, extortion, falsifying public records, and witness intimidation. His attorneys could not stop the handcuffs from closing around his wrists. Rebecca immediately announced that Summit Shield had terminated all negotiations with Holloway and would never conduct business with him. Before Mason left, she offered him the position of Rescue Training Director. Mason did not accept immediately, but he promised to consider it. Outside City Hall, Daniel Mercer opened the rear door of an animal control vehicle. Atlas emerged wearing his support harness. The moment he saw Mason, the old German shepherd broke into an uneven run and threw himself against his owner's chest. Mason dropped to his knees and held him tightly as the crowd applauded. For once, he did not hide his tears. 6 months after the hearing, Liberty House no longer carried demolition notices on its doors. Federal investigators recovered millions of dollars from Grant Holloway's fraudulent development projects, and part of the restitution fund was used to repair the aging residence. New heating systems replaced the failing boilers, damaged windows were sealed, and the entrance was widened for veterans who used wheelchairs. Olivia Bennett opened a small legal aid office on the first floor, offering free representation to former service members facing eviction, denied benefits, or predatory contracts. Her desk was rarely empty, but for the first time in years, she felt that her work was building something instead of merely preventing destruction. Peter Nolan entered the Federal Witness Protection Program long enough to secure his family's safety. When the immediate danger passed, he accepted an accounting position with a nonprofit supporting homeless veterans. The quiet man who had once hidden Grant's transactions now used the same financial skills to expose dishonest landlords and recover stolen benefits. Emma Price received a journalism scholarship from a Colorado university after her video and testimony became symbols of responsible reporting. She continued working part-time at the Grand Meridian, but she no longer lowered her eyes when powerful guests entered the lobby. Rebecca Shaw invested her own money, along with donations from Summit Shield employees, in a wide property beneath the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. The land included open meadows, pine forests, training fields, veterinary rooms, and several simple cabins. She named it Second Watch Ranch, a sanctuary where veterans and retired working dogs could recover without locked wards, crowded streets, or judgment. Mason accepted Rebecca's offer to manage the ranch and direct its rescue training program. He taught younger handlers that discipline meant control, not aggression, and that bringing someone home required patience as much as courage. His own cabin stood at the edge of the property. It had broad windows facing the mountains, high ceilings, and doors that opened onto the porch. Mason still woke from nightmares, but he no longer reached for his truck keys. When panic tightened his chest, he opened the doors, listened to Atlas breathing, and watched the horizon until the past loosened its grip. At the ranch's opening ceremony, Atlas stood beside Mason, wearing a clean service harness. The old German shepherd's limp remained, but his eyes were bright and alert. Rebecca placed a new medal around his neck, honoring both his military service and the life he had saved outside the Grand Meridian. The gathered veterans rose and applauded, while Mason rested a hand on Atlas's scarred shoulder. Caleb spent nearly every weekend at the ranch. He had begun speaking confidently again and followed Dr. Hannah Lee during veterinary visits, asking so many questions that she gave him a small notebook for medical observations. He announced that he intended to become a veterinarian specializing in retired service animals. Mason and Olivia never rushed what was growing between them. Their relationship developed through shared coffee, quiet conversations, and long walks across the property. Olivia understood that some silences needed companionship rather than answers, while Mason slowly learned that accepting care was not the same as surrendering strength. One golden evening, Caleb ran through the meadow with Atlas moving happily behind him. Olivia stood beside Mason on the cabin porch as sunlight spread across the mountains. Atlas eventually turned and limped back toward them, his medal shining against his chest. Mason knelt and opened his arms. Atlas pressed against him, tail moving steadily. Mason looked at Olivia, then at the home waiting behind them. "We finally made it back," he whispered. "Both of us." Sometimes, God does not lead us home by removing every storm. Sometimes he sends someone to walk beside us until we find the strength to keep going. For Mason, that blessing came on 4 scarred paws. Atlas never cared about medals, wealth, or appearances. He only knew loyalty, and he refused to abandon the man who had once saved him. Perhaps that is the true meaning of grace. Being loved even when we feel broken, and being given another chance when we believe we no longer deserve one. Do you believe Atlas was sent into Mason's life for a greater purpose? And should people like Grant be forgiven after facing justice? Or are some acts of cruelty impossible to excuse? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next powerful stories about loyalty, courage, faith, and second chances.